All right, so this is just a quick review over the city models that we looked at in class the other day. So if you weren't here, you need to come get this chart so that way you can fill it out, and you'll need to grab a few textbooks to draw them over on the right-hand column. So when we go, we're going to look at all of these different models that are listed in the left-hand column, and then we will work our way across. So what I told everybody the other day is that these models are kind of the way that old dead guys kind of came up to explain how cities grew and where they kind of centered around and where people lived. So the big idea here is that there are different types of land use. So is the land being used for commercial reasons? Remember, commercial was like the businesses and the industries in a city, or is it used for residential purposes? Residential means where people live, right? What types of housing are involved? And then is there things like transportation that you have to consider within cities? The answer is going to be yes, but what type and how do they have the infrastructure to hold those different types of transportation. And then also remember how in our iBook Party video we talked about how you have to be environmentally friendly. So some of these cities or most cities have some sort of like central park or green belts or squares or spaces where people can congregate that doesn't necessarily include a lot of like concrete, right? Like more environmentally friendly. So green spaces, think green spaces there. So as we go through these 6 different models, you need to fill out your chart kind of the way that I am filling out mine. So the first one that we have is the concentric zone model. So this one was made in the 1920s. This is kind of like our first model. It's also called the Burgess model. Okay, so this the main features really of this one is that it's really just all about rings. So it looks like a whole bunch of rings around the CBD. CBD, remember, is the central business district, so think like downtown. So if we're drawing it over here, our CBD is going to be right in the middle, and then it's going to have different rings on the outside of it, okay? So the CBD, think that's like your historic like downtown. So think a really long time ago when when people were first starting to come to cities, that today is going to be your CBD. So that was like the historic part of like downtown. And all of these models are going to have some sort of CBD, especially in the American models, they will all have that CBD that is right in the middle. So whenever you draw it over here on the right side, you'll want to come in and grab some textbooks to draw them. And that way I can explain to you the different parts, because I'm not going to label every part of the model. I just want you to kind of see what it looks like. So make sure that you come in and look at the different models, and I will need to explain those to you, okay? So back to the main features. So it's going to be rings around the CBD, just like we just drew. The further you go out, the richer the people get, okay? Further out, richer the people are. And that is because this is all in the 1920s. So if you think about in the 20s, what types of transportation people had, not a lot of people are going to have transportation yet, right? Like cars are just coming about, and so cities are still pretty close together. So in the 20s, not many people have cars, okay? So have cars. So because of that, our city is still within a 5-mile radius, okay? So that means our cities are still pretty close together, because people don't have cars, that means that people aren't really spreading out yet. So the suburbs aren't really a thing yet. But our farthest ring way out here, this is going to be our richest people, because those are going to be the people who actually do have cars, but there's not going to be a whole lot of them, okay? So still remember that this model is going to be very compact, pretty small inside, okay? So when we fill out this middle column here, where do the different classes of people live? So the poor people, our lower class, are going to be with the industry in the middle, so close to the CBD. Okay, our middle class is going to be truly in the middle rings, in the next rings out. And then our upper class, like I just said, is going to be the furthest out. Because remember, they are the ones that have the cars. Okay, the next one that we have is called the sector model. The sector model is going to come out a few years after the concentric zone model. It's going to happen in about the 1930s. It's also called the Hoyt model. That's an H, sorry. Okay, so this one is, I'm going to kind of draw it first so you can see it, but this one is again going to have the CBD in the middle. It's going to be circular again, but this time, so think of the term sector. It's kind of like in sections, really. Okay, so when you have your CBD here in the middle, there's going to be this kind of zone out of the CBD that's going to be like your industry and transportation model, okay? So, or section, I guess. So that's kind of like your industry, transportation. Okay, so that's that one right there. Okay, so because of that, you're gonna have these corresponding sections right next to it that are going to be for your lower class. Okay, so this one's pretty easy to remember because just think like those are really going to be your lower class because they can't really choose where they want to live. Now, on the opposite end of that, your rich people are going to live the furthest away from your transportation and industry, okay? So that's going to be your upper class because they can choose where they want to live, right? So your upper class has more money to kind of decide where they want to build their house, right? And they're not going to choose to live over close to the industry and the transportation, okay? Because it's loud, it's smoggy, it's not as nice over there, right? So the upper class is going to choose to live further away. Now, your lower class, since they don't have that kind of freedom to do that, they are going to live closer to the transportation and the industry. That's why their wedges are closer together. Now, the middle class is all of those blank spaces that you kind of see. They're kind of just thrown everywhere else. So that's kind of what the model looks like. Now, if we go back over to explain the main features here, we need to write that these grow out in sections, right? Sections that grow out from the CBD. Because this is still the 30s, not everybody has cars still, so this is still kind of a small radius here for the city. It's not too far out yet. Another thing, let's see, the another main thing that is accounted here in this one that's not really in a whole lot of the other models is that transportation is accounted for in this model, and it's not like that in a lot of the other models. So transportation could look like highways or railroads, or could even be like a river. If your city is located on a river, right, you'll have boats that come in and out that bring stuff into the cities, right, to the businesses and stuff. So that's pretty important in this one. And then the other thing that I said earlier is that there's a corresponding wedge for your lower class. Okay, so for lower class. So that just means that within your transportation and industry wedge, those are all going to kind of go together, okay? And your lower class is going to live next to that wedge, because those are the people who are really going to be working in that type of and those types of jobs. And so your upper class won't necessarily be doing the manual labor lower jobs like that. So that's going to be your lower class. And because that lower class doesn't necessarily have probably means to a car, they're going to need to be next to that transportation wedge too, because they're going to have to use that public transportation that's offered to them. So when we write about this, our lower class is next to transportation and industry, like we just said, and industry. And then our middle class is kind of spread out. They're going to be kind of near these areas too, but spread out, right? Kind of like the leftovers. They're just going to kind of fill in wherever they can. And then like we said earlier, our upper class is going to be in a wedge furthest away from the transportation and industry. Because they can afford it, remember? Because of the money. They have all of the money, okay? Next, we have the multiple nuclei model. So this is also known as the Harris and Ullman, I think that's how you spell it, model. So those are the two guys who basically made it up, right? And this is going to be in 1945 that they're going to come up with this model. So this model is going to be the first one that really kind of looks different. It's going to be this weird looking square. Oof, I think I already messed that up. So this weird looking square here with lots of different like sections, okay? But it's still going to have a CBD, okay, in the middle. And so this is really just going to look like a bunch of different like sections here. Again, I'm not really doing this too much justice here, but there's going to be different like groups here, different nuclei, like little sections here, okay? So what's important here is that if you have like your industry over here, you're going to have your lower class that's still going to live next to that. So similar to the sector model in that, because your upper class is going to be over here, farther away from that industry still, okay? Your middle class is going to kind of be left in the middle, but you're also going to have like other mini outlying business areas, okay? So like kind of think like mini CBDs almost, and you're also going to have suburbs too. So with this model, this is like the first time that you really start to see suburbs. So if we're explaining this kind of model, if you notice, there's like different sections, right? But this happens because there are like many nodes around the CBD. So if you think about this time period that we're in with the 40s, right, people are starting to have more cars at this point. And so this is kind of really the first time that we start to see people spread out. So like our first suburbs really start happening here. Ooh, that doesn't make sense. Here we go, spread out suburbs, right? So the first of like suburbanization is happening here. And so with that, people start spreading out. And so people start kind of clustering around different things. So think nodes, right? This is called multiple nuclei. If you're thinking about biology, a nucleus is like the brain of the cell, right? So if we're applying that to a city model, that means that there's going to be many like brains almost throughout the city. So many like areas that people are going to cluster around. And that can be these nodes that we call them. These nodes can be different activities that people cluster around. Okay, so with that, it can be like small CBDs. So like in the bottom left-hand corner that I drew, like a smaller outlying business area, okay? Or maybe it could be a university that people will cluster around, or maybe a port, or what else could it be? Like a business park where there's a cluster of businesses, right? Or neighborhood or something like that. So Think Frisco, okay? Frisco was made off of the multiple nuclei model. So if you think about it, you have the mall area down there closer to 121, right? Now we have the Star that has popped up that things are starting to cluster around. We have the Main Street area with FC Dallas in the movie theater, and that hospital just went up, right? So that could be another little node. So Frisco was truly designed off of the multiple nuclei model. There's a lot of different little clusters and pockets that people have clustered around, okay? So that's what's important here. Again, the big idea here is that your industry and your upper class are never together. So your expensive housing are not together. Okay, so you'll never see those together. That's in a lot of these American models especially, okay? So your lower class is near the manufacturing and industry, like in the other ones. Your middle class is pretty much near the CBD. And but not next to the industry. We can put that down, not next to industry. And your upper class is always away from the industry. And remember, this is the first time that we really start to see suburbs. The suburbs start coming about, and they will cluster around those outlying areas. Around those, you could call them mini CBDs. Okay. So next we have the galactic city model, and this model was made in the 1950s. So this is important to know because this is really when suburbanization happened. So people are leaving the downtown areas because now they have money, they have cars, and they want to start moving out towards the suburbs, okay? So it's really big to know that this is happening in the 1950s. So this one is probably more relevant kind of to us because it is what we're used to and probably something that we can relate to the most. So if we are drawing this, we're still going to have our CBD downtown, but this model is really big in that it has a beltway that goes around it. So think of a belt as something that like goes around your waist, right? Like a normal belt, and it's circle. So it's like a circle that goes around the city, and this is like a beltway, usually like a highway, okay? So if we are thinking, if we can relate this to Dallas, this can be our example too. Okay, so if this is going to be Dallas, our CBD is downtown, and this highway is like 635. It's a highway, okay? It's an interstate that kind of circles Dallas. And if you're looking at a map, there's a whole bunch of roads that kind of start coming out of Dallas that kind of intersect at this this highway 635 that goes around it, okay? And when you have that happen, people, like, if you think about it, in the 50s, like I just said, like, people are moving out because of suburbanization. So people are starting to live in houses, out on the outskirts now because people have cars and then they can get into the CBD. So when people start moving outwards, then you have these little edge cities that pop up really at the intersection of these big highways, right? So these are called edge cities. Ooh, that's a bad building. Okay, so these are edge cities. And that is going to be a big thing with this model, is that you have edge cities, because when the people start moving further out, the businesses and everything like that is going to move out where the people are. Okay, so some main features here is that it grows out of urban areas. So it's really about the suburbs here. Okay, so remember we have the Beltway and edge cities around the urban area. And so at the intersections is where, at the intersections of our transportation routes, so think highways, there are many like downtown areas, okay? And so with that, there's usually tall buildings that pop up. What else? Like shops, some residences, right, that go up. So with this model, we don't know a whole lot about our lower class, but we can assume that they're going to be left in the middle near the CBD, because it's the middle and upper class that are going to be moving further out. That they're near CBD, because they just won't have the access to transportation to drive in and out of the city every day. But this means that the middle and upper class have moved out to the suburbs. Okay, so they can afford to move further out. So it's probably like your lower class are going to be really in there, and then your middle class kind of out there, and then your upper class further out. But again, the model isn't super specific on where the different classes are living, but just think common sense, right? If people are moving out to the suburbs, that's probably going to be your middle class and your upper class, because they can afford it. Okay, now another really good example of this, if you can't picture what 635 looks like when you're driving down into Dallas, think right here in Frisco. Okay, so think Legacy West and the shops right there. Remember, think of what is it called? The shops at Legacy, right? So I know that you're probably familiar with that. So right there, that's right at the intersection of the Tollway and 121. Okay, and there's all of those big buildings that are going up right there because all of those companies are moving into Frisco now. And so that's like your edge city, right? You have these really tall buildings that are being built right there at that intersection. And then you had all of these other things that started popping up too. So you had the shops that popped up, and then Legacy West, right? You had all of those like restaurants and little stores, and there's hotels down there now. And now there's even like apartments and residential areas close by. And so that little edge city has popped up right there at the intersection of 121 and the Tollway. And that is essentially a galactic city. Like that helps us form the galactic city model because that is an edge city, okay? Okay, so next we have our Latin America model. So the previous 4 models that can all be found in the USA and Canada, but these next 2 models are found outside of America. So it might be harder for us to kind of think about these models because they're going to be different than what we are used to, okay? So the Latin America model kind of came about in 1980. It's also known as the Griffin-Ford model, okay? So this one is really a combination of both sectors and zones. If you think about the concentric zone model that we talked about on the other page and the sector model, it kind of combines both of them if you're looking at the model. But a big difference is that it's going to have a 2-part CBD, so kind of like a traditional market area where people go and sell their goods, and then a more current, like modern, tall building CBD that we're used to. Okay. So it's going to kind of have both of those, and they're going to be very close together in the middle of the model. A big difference here is that the high quality housing, or our rich people, they're not going to locate on the outskirts, kind of like all the American models showed. The high quality housing and the rich people are going to be near the urban core. So they're going to be more in the middle here, okay? And I'll explain why in a second whenever I draw it out. And then the further out is the lower housing. Okay, so with this model, I'm going to draw it over here in the right-hand column. It is going to be, again, another circular area. Okay, and we're going to have our 2-part CBD here in the middle. We'll have the CBD in the market. Okay, you know what that says, market. And then it's going to look kind of weird. Okay, so we have like this mall area that comes out like this. And that's going to include all of this area, but it's not like a mall that we know of, like where there's stores and stuff in one big building. This mall area really just kind of refers to like a commercial area. So think stores, think shops, think businesses all along this little like this spine area. And then you're gonna have your rich people living here nearby, okay? So that is your rich people. So this is where it's really different because they want to live close to like where the business and stuff is happening, okay? So then further away from these rich people, you're going to have your industry and another little spine coming off this way, but this is our industry area, okay? Again, this is similar to like the other models because the industry is going to be further away from the rich people, okay? That was kind of like what it was in the sector model, in the multiple nuclei model. The industry is not really taking place near the rich people, okay? And so you kind of have these circular areas that come about, and your middle class is kind of living here all in the middle. And then the furthest you have out, this again is like your middle class. Your middle class is really, there's all of these different names for your middle class where I'm drawing all these squigglies. They have different types of names for them, but basically it's just your middle class. Your middle class is kind of filling in around. But out here on the outskirts where I'm drawing these lines, these are your squatter settlements, or really think about it, that's your favelas. Remember that word that we heard from the IBOC party? It's really just referring to the really poor people who move into an urban area and then they don't have enough money for housing or apartments, and so they just kind of set up these little slums on the outskirts. But since we're in the Latin America model, the term for that in Latin America is called the favelas, like the man talked about in the IBOC party video that we watched last week. So the favelas are going to be on the outskirts, okay? And sometimes this can have like crime and street life and stuff like that, but it's really just the very poor part is going to be on the outskirts, and then your middle class is kind of filling in the middle, okay? So again, you will need to come in and grab a textbook and look at the model on the link that I posted onto Classroom. That way you can really see the difference, because clearly my drawing right here is not the best and it looks pretty confusing now that I'm looking at it. But you need to see what it actually looks like and all the different pieces to it. Okay, so please do not just rely on my drawing right now, because it's pretty ugly. Okay, so then in this middle column, let's talk about where people are living. So our poor, our lower class, and lowest class, they are living further out. Okay, so they're the furthest out, that furthest ring out, okay? So this could be like where crime is happening and like poor infrastructure. Remember, the guy from Rio was saying that you have to update I spelled that wrong. Infrastructure. The guy from Rio was saying that you have to make sure that people have adequate housing and healthcare and education, right? And all of that infrastructure. And sometimes that just doesn't happen in Latin America cities, which is why these favelas are so bad off, okay? And then we know that our middle class is near the urban core. And they're the ones that are going to be closest to the industry too. To that industry and manufacturing, okay? And then the big difference here is that our upper class is going to be closest to the CBD in this model. And commercial area. And lastly, we're going to have our African city model. So this is going to happen in the 19th century. So that's what, 1800s? Yeah. So this is a really old model. And I'm going to draw it out because it's going to help us first. Okay. So again, this is going to be a circular model. Okay. And then we're going to have a ring on the outside again. And then in the middle, this is where things get a little bit different. There are three kind of parts here in the middle that make up kind of our middle core CBD kind of. So in one of these areas in the middle, that is going to be our traditional CBD. So this is what where people were congregating, selling their stuff, a really long time ago. Okay, so remember, we're in Africa. We know that they are LDCs, and then also think back to Unit 4 when we were talking about imperialism, right? We know that the Europeans came and broke up Africa and all of the countries that were there because they wanted the resources that were in Africa. Okay, so when those European colonies kind of started setting up in these African cities, they made this other CBD, and so that is like called the colonial CBD, and that is still prevalent in current African cities because it just kind of stuck and stayed there. So there's kind of two CBDs. There's a traditional one where people were before they were colonized, and then the colonizers, aka the Europeans, came in and they set up this separate CBD area, okay, and it's still there today. Okay, and then you have this separate model or the separate section over here, and that is going to be it's called our market zone. So think like this is very informal. It's where people go to sell their goods. It's very temporary. So people are going there like on a daily basis, bringing in maybe like a woven rug that they have made or stuff that they have planted, and that they have grown to sell for profit. Okay, so think like a farmer's market where it's very temporary. That's like what this market area is. Okay, so that's going to form like our middle part here. And then all of this in the middle right here, these are where our neighborhoods are going to be. But what's different here is that it is going to be ethnic neighborhoods. Remember how we've talked about Rwanda and how there are different groups of people there. And then a few weeks ago, we looked at Nigeria and how there's a lot of different cultural groups there. We know that Africa has a lot of different groups of people, right, based off of their ethnicities and their cultures. Okay, so lots of different groups of people. And so in this African city model, there are going to be neighborhoods that set up outside of the CBD area based on their different culture groups. So they're going to kind of be attracted to people who are like them, and so they're going to form these neighborhoods based on these different cultural groups. Okay, and then again, on the very outskirts of town, I'm going to leave that blank, but on the very outskirts, these are our informal settlements. Okay, so think slums, right? Because we know that Africa is very poor, right? But then we have these big mega cities that are starting to pop up in Africa. And so people are rushing to these cities in Africa. But again, they don't have a lot of money. And so they're kind of forming these informal settlements, or they're like the slums, right? So like the favelas in the model above, it's the very poor part where people don't have a lot of money. There's like hardly any infrastructure again, so not a lot of running water or electricity, right? So these really poor areas, but people are flooding into the cities so that way they can get jobs, but they just don't have anywhere to live. So then they're forced onto the outskirts. Okay, so that's really what the model is going to look like. If we are filling out our notes over here, the main features, the big idea here is going to be that European colonization really affected this model. Okay, so we know that it set up a separate CBD. Okay, so it's really important to know here. We have traditional and colonial CBDs because of that. Okay, another thing that we need to know is that these cities are growing very fast. like way faster than other places in the world. So what I was telling groups is that in your lifetime, you will see the largest growth of cities happening in Africa. You know, think about how a lot of our really big cities right now are in Asia. Well, that boom is about to happen in Africa. So by the time you're an adult or by the time that you are a grandparent, you are going to see really, really large cities forming in Africa. And I know that sounds crazy right now because it's so poor, but that is hopefully going to be changing, and people are going to keep moving to these cities. And so with that, the informal settlements, the informal part, like the growing slums, are just going to keep growing faster and faster. So the informal settlement residential areas are like booming. Okay, so they're gonna take over each other, honestly. So like these big mega cities they keep forming, they just start like spilling over into each other. Okay, so that's just gonna keep growing outwards and just gonna grow really fast. But another thing that we know with these LDC countries is that transportation and infrastructure really is not the best. So all of that is going to have to improve when these cities start growing really big. Okay, so with our model, if we're looking at this middle section, there's honestly not a whole lot of info about what groups of people, like as far as upper middle, we don't really know a whole lot about where they live, okay? But we can assume that these mixed neighborhoods that I talked about, right, based off of their different, did I spell that right? Yeah, I think I did. Based off of their different cultural groups, we can assume that those mixed neighborhoods are probably like our middle and upper class. Okay, that's probably what that is. So your richer people kind of are going to be living closer to the middle, because we definitely know that the lower class is in the poor, right? They are, they're in the outskirts. They're the farthest away. So kind of like the Latin America model. They're in the outskirts, in the slums. And that's their biggest population. Okay, they have a very large growing slum population. Okay. So I think that I covered all of the big ideas for all of these models. Again, if you were absent, you need to come in and get the chart to fill out that I just filled out here, and you need to check out the link that I posted on Classroom. And then you'll need to come in and look at some visuals, because clearly I'm not the best artist, so you'll need to come in and look at some pictures from the books, and I can help explain anything that you don't understand. And then you need to come get the writing Venn diagram assignment, because this will all be a daily grade. So make sure that you are coming in to figure everything out. Thanks.